What is going on, everybody? I hope you're having a great day today. This is Alex from the Fresh Fantasy Podcast. This is the third episode of Season 4. Today, we're talking about early overvalued players. These are guys we are feeling are getting a little too much love, and we should probably bring down our expectations just a little bit. Today, we are using Underdog ADP as we feel like it is the most relevant and accurate at this point in the season with everyone doing their best ball drafts and all that. But we're talking overvalued. These are pretty hard things to talk about, and not everyone can handle it. So I needed to bring in a very special guest. So joining me to break this all down today is a man who was formerly a financial manager at a Fortune 100 company, turned fantasy football superstar after working at places like Pro Football Network, The Athletic, Fantasy Pros, and is now a fantasy football analyst at the worldwide leader in sports. So returning to the show with over 30,000 followers on Twitter now, he is ESPN's Eric Moody. Welcome back, Eric. I think this is your third or fourth appearance now on the Fresh Fantasy Podcast.
Yeah, I think so. Hey, it's always good to come back. I love that intro, man. I may need to hire you to do that. No, that was great. I appreciate the kind words, but hey, it's always good to talk fantasy football. I get the message from you. Hey, if I got time on my calendar, I will be here. And it's a lot that's going on. You got the NFL draft that's coming up. We just got out of free agency. I know the NBA playoff picture is starting to solidify. WNBA season's right around the corner, so it's busy in the sports world. But I love talking about football, so let's get into it, my man.
Oh, you cannot get enough of it, especially this is a time in sports where most people think it's very lull. You know what I mean? We're not in the summer yet. We're getting closer to training camp. Like the NFL season just ended, but we have March Madness going on. Yeah. NFL draft is about to start. NBA playoffs, NHL playoffs, you name it, it is about to happen. But today we're here to talk about overvalued players and some things that we should probably be pegging down some expectations. Eric, I don't want to disappoint the people yet. I will let you do that because you work for ESPN. So who is your first player that we should be lowering their expectations on via Underdog ADP?
You know what? It really pains me to say this, but I'm going to go with DeAndre Swift. Unfortunately.
Oh man.
I know. I'm breaking my heart. I'm breaking other people's heart. Just like I guess what Padme broke Anakin Skywalker's heart in Revenge of the Sith. Anyway, I digress. But I look at Swift. I'm like, he's the RB18, I believe, in Underdog ADP, and I think back to this time last year. There was a lot of hype surrounding Swift. I'm like, fantasy managers. I'm like, we bought into the hype. We felt vindicated the early part of last season. You remember those first 2 weeks, it was against the Eagles and the Commanders, where, this is a guy that had 262 total yards and 2 touchdowns on 25 touches, and we were feeling pretty good. Many felt that, hey, look at Swift's usage. It can only go up from here, right? We were ultimately wrong because it never came to fruition. And, he dealt with multiple injuries. His workload was managed, off and on throughout the remainder of the season. And these are some of the factors that led to Jamal Williams putting up a career season. He dominated the early down work in the red zone, led the league with 17 rushing touchdowns. Williams was so good. He even surpassed a franchise record in Detroit that was set by Hall of Famer Barry Sanders in 1991 in terms of touchdowns. And he also rushed for a career high 1,066 yards. And also, he became the first Lions player to surpass 1,000 rushing yards in a season since Reggie Bush did it in 2013. Now, Alex, I know you're wondering, why am I going down this rabbit hole here? And here's why. The reason I'm giving everyone so much detail is that the Lions clearly do not have confidence in Swift to handle a large workload. Yeah, I said it. That's why they brought in David Montgomery. And one thing about Montgomery over these last 2 seasons, I'm like, this is a guy that's averaged 17 touches and 75.6 total yards per game over the last 2 seasons. He's also criminally underutilized as a receiver out of the backfield. I think that could change in Detroit this year. I'd just rather wait. Instead of drafting Swift, I'd rather prioritize Montgomery or some other players who have a similar ADP, guys like Tyler Algier or Rachaad White. So those are a few thoughts on Swift.
Yeah, No, as someone who is probably as big of a DeAndre Swift fan as anyone, I own 2 signed jerseys. DeAndre Swift is one of them. Jalen Hurts is the other. I was all in on him. This podcast is all in on him. And all the historical metrics on Swift have mostly held up. It's more been a thing of handling workload and staying healthy, unfortunately. And even Dan Campbell said himself that DeAndre Swift is still fully in the Lions' plans. It's just a matter of how can we keep this kid on the field. And he said we had a plan last year, and it obviously did not work out, which means that they probably had him in at bell cow usage, just don't know if his body can handle it. So DeAndre Swift, unfortunately, has to be someone that is just a little bit too overvalued. I don't know if he can handle the workload, but my, oh my, I hope he does eventually. Another potential fantasy heartbreaker, a guy that I absolutely love as a player, a person, and in the fantasy football landscape is Dameon Pierce. I mean, Dameon Pierce last year took the league by storm. As a rookie, he averaged 19.9 touches per game, which is fourth in the NFL. But now the Houston Texans have signed Devin Singletary, and Dameon Pierce is going as the running back 19, one spot behind DeAndre Swift. And last year, in games with 20-plus touches, he saw 17 fantasy points per game, or in the games without 20-plus touches, he averaged just 8.7 fantasy points per game. When the touches were not there, he was not producing as much. And with Devin Singletary and potentially them drafting another running back, we just don't think that ultimately Dameon Pierce is going to be able to be that same guy. He, on the outside, looked really great, where he was 11th in evaded tackles and 15th in yards created, but on a per touch basis, he was just 22nd in evaded tackles per touch and 23rd in yards created per touch. So while he looked he was, doing a lot of great things in the field, it was more because of volume, and he wasn't as efficient as it looked. Ultimately, because of that, and I'm signing Devin Singletary, I'm a little less optimistic, and I have him more in the mid running back 20s right now. But what do you think, Eric? Do you think that he's going to take a big leap in his second year and completely quell any concerns and move Devin Singletary out of the way? Or do you think that we should be a little bit more worried about him because he doesn't catch a lot of passes?
No, I think you're spot on. Yeah, I would be worried because you don't bring someone like Singletary in, especially considering his body of work with Buffalo. And the crazy thing is that I think Buffalo, I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but I think during his career there, they rank like near the bottom of the league in I think like rushing attempts. And so he's been productive on essentially limited volume. And so now I'm right there with you. They wouldn't have brought Singletary in if he's not going to have a defined role. And to your point, I'm like, what made Dameon Pierce so appealing was the workload. And so, again, he's not a player that I would necessarily reach for in drafts, but so I'm right there aligned with you.
Yeah, let's stick at the running back position. Who is another running back that you feel is a little bit overvalued in fantasy football right now?
Yeah, it's another one that pains me to say this, but I'm going to go with Joe Mixon here, who's, I guess, ADP has been kind of up and down this offseason so far. I think he's the RB 24. It's just multiple signs are suggesting that the Bengals are going to move on from Mixon due to a combination of different things. Look at his age, his salary, off-the-field incidents. And I think fantasy managers are really, I think the right word would be intoxicated by Mixon's statistical production over the last two seasons. I'm like, he's averaged 20 touches, 92.5 total yards, and 17.5 fantasy points per game, again, over the last two seasons. And the one thing about Cincinnati, they are legitimate Super Bowl contenders with Joe Burrow under center. And I think it's just really important for them to capitalize on this window. And by cutting Mixon, it would help with that. But from a film perspective, there's no way to really quantify this for fantasy. But in my opinion, I'm like, this is a guy that really struggles in pass protection. And we all saw how productive Samaje Perine was last season when given, an opportunity late. He prospered, put together some really good performances for fantasy managers. And so, if released, another team most likely give Mixon an opportunity. I just don't believe that fantasy managers should assume that he'll be provided a similar workload. He could find himself as part of a running back by committee. And so, again, that's that's a few reasons on why I'm necessarily not prioritizing someone like Mixon in best ball drafts right now. I just rather look at other options.
I'm going to have to disagree with you big time here. I'm actually very in on Mixon given his running back 24 price right now. He's played 5 seasons in the NFL. He's played 4 seasons where he played at least 8 games. And in those seasons, he finishes the running back 10, 13, 4, and 10. Top 13 finish every year he's played at least 8 games. But the biggest thing that I stand a little bit differently on you is the fact that I don't think they're going to cut him because Samaje Perine went to Denver for just $3.5 million per year. I think if they were going to cut Mixon with his massive salary, they would have done it, and they would have paid Samaje Perine just a little bit more than they were going to pay him, than Denver was going to pay him. Yeah. And the only other Cincinnati running backs under contract are Chris Evans and Travion Williams, who have 95 combined touches in their career. And because of that and the fact that they have not cut Mixon, this is not before free agency. We're after it now. We're getting closer to the draft. Of course, they could draft someone, cut him, say see you later. But I feel like if they wanted to save that money, they probably would have cut him already and signed someone else potentially in free agency, like a Samaje Perine. I think that's what they should have done, Eric. I don't think he should be on this team anymore with how much they are paying the man. But ultimately, he just came off a career high 75 targets, a career high 60 catches, and Samaje Perine is gone. And he was so good for them. It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, he was.
But if he's only finished top 13 and it seems like they're going to keep him, I think that I am going to go. But I think that, just let me wrap this up for the people, though, is it's mostly about whether or not they keep them. I think that we both agree that if they keep him, he's probably going to be really productive. If they get rid of him, he is not going to be productive. But right now, I think they're going to keep him. You think they're not. Let the people decide for themselves.
Let's see.
But the other player that I want to talk about that I just cannot get behind, and I'm so sorry, people, this is probably the one I will take the most hate for, is J.K. Dobbins. And J.K. Dobbins is just in a situation that is not good for fantasy running backs. This is assuming Lamar Jackson stays on the team. Over the last 4 seasons, only one running back has surpassed 30 targets, which was Devontae Freeman at 42, which is less than 3 targets per game. And ultimately, they just don't give Ravens running back snaps. A Ravens running back has hit 60% of the snaps or more in just 11 of their last 32 games. That is any running back hitting 60%, not just their starting running back. And J.K. Dobbins in 26 career games has hit 60% of the snaps just twice. He is going as the running back 20 right behind Swift and Pierce. And I just don't think that he is going to get either the passing down volume or the snap volume to be as productive as we need him to be. We're going to need him to be insanely efficient. How do you feel about J.K. Dobbins? Do you think that there's a little more positivity to be had?
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to be positive in that scenario, especially if they don't have like Lamar Jackson, like you were saying. It's just a tough situation because the whole offense is going to be, I guess what's the right word, degraded without having Jackson in there. And so if Jackson does come back, it could be a different scenario with Dobbins. Another year removed from the massive knee injury that he had. But it's just tough to have confidence in Dobbins, Mark Andrews, Rashad Bateman, if Lamar Jackson isn't there. So now I'm right there with you. I think he's someone that could be overvalued right now because people are drafting him at what do you think, like a ceiling right now, as opposed to, it's just a wide range of outcomes. But I would say like people are drafting him at his ceiling right now, which is not really what I'm kind of looking for because it's unlikely to happen. So just a thought.
Yeah. What about the wide receiver position? Like, I think we both have a couple guys to talk about at wide receiver. Who's one wide receiver that you think right now is a little overvalued, that's getting a little too much love in the fantasy world?
Yeah, I would go with Calvin Ridley. It's like the wide receiver 19. Just looking at ADP and doing some drafts, it's just not a guy I find myself like aggressively targeting. I guess here's the reason why. And some people their mouth may be like wide open right now as I'm going through this, but I would just say many fantasy managers are assuming that, hey, Ridley's going to be the same player that we saw way back in week 7 of the 2021 season. I'm like his last full season that he played, like he finishes the wide receiver 4, which is phenomenal. And don't get me wrong, I'm like he is going to help Trevor Lawrence and his Jaguars offense, but I just think it may be premature to, what's the right word? I would say anoint Ridley as the Jaguars' number 1 receiver. He'll definitely play a role. But you look at Jacksonville last year, I'm like, they were successful kind of taking that, I guess, receiver by committee approach because they had Christian Kirk. He had his moment. Zay Jones, Evan Ingram was even involved. So you add Ridley to that dynamic, and I think great things are going to happen. But I just think it's going to take some time for Ridley to get acclimated or reacclimated, I would say, to the NFL game from being away for so long. There are just other wide receivers with a similar ADP or later that I'd rather prioritize. I know a few that come to mind are like Amari Cooper, Jerry Jeudy's out there with a similar ADP. You got Drake London and Marquise Brown that are available like a little bit later. Those are just a few names that come to mind, but just not that big on Calvin Ridley right now at his ADP.
Oh, that is tough to hear as someone that is a Calvin Ridley fan. I do like that they were very willing to give receivers, high snaps last year. I mean, they had a number of receivers that played in the high 80% of their snaps. So I think as long as that continues, but for me, I feel like with, is Calvin Ridley going to be the alpha wide receiver 1? I don't know. But I feel like that whether it was Zay Jones or Christian Kirk or Evan Ingram, I just don't think any of one of those guys is a true alpha wide receiver. Mm-hmm. So if I would say that in the back half of the season, I'm a little bit more confident in Ridley to live up to that price tag. But I think it might take a few games for him to be that same Calvin Ridley, because the last time that we saw him play was like the first 5 weeks of, I think it was 2020 now. we're in 2023. It's been a long time since
Yeah.
we've, truly seen him on the field at this point. And for that reason, I think that ultimately it's going to take him a little bit to get up to speed. I'm with you. I think he's just going a little bit too high. Someone I like if he drops a little bit lower, but right now it's just too high price to be paying for what he is going to deliver you in week one. Another guy that is, I think, going right around the same range that I just cannot get behind is DJ Moore. On the surface, I love it. Justin Fields is finally going to have his number one wide receiver, but looking at the numbers, I just don't think that they add up to DJ Moore being productive. For one, the Bears were dead last in NFL pass attempts in 22 and had just 359 team targets. And if you include DJ Moore's career 28% target rate, that's just 101 targets last year. And, even last year, Panthers QB Sam Darnold was a lot more accurate than Justin Fields was. He was third in completion percentage over expected, while Fields was 36th. Sam Darnold was 10th in on-throw target percentage, where Fields was 28th. I get it. The Bears are going to throw more. Justin Fields will be better. But I think that ultimately the passing volume would have to go up by an astronomical amount for DJ Moore to be really productive this year. But what about you on DJ Moore? Are you more of a believer than I am and that this Chicago situation is finally going to get him, a true QB1? Or do you think that, the passing volume might not be there kind of on the tune of where I'm talking about?
Yeah, it's. I think it's a better real life NFL signing more so than fantasy. You still have a number of players that are there. I know you've got obviously got Moore. You've got Cole Kmet's still there, Darnell Mooney, and so it's. I think it's better in real life NFL as opposed to fantasy. Now again, if I'm in a draft and then Moore drops. Like a round or two. I'm definitely willing to pick him up and add him to the team, but I just see this still being a run-heavy team, and also you've got Justin Fields who likes to tuck in and run as well, which adds to his fantasy value and mystique as well. So I'm right there with you. Not a guy that I'm aggressively targeting in drafts in DJ Moore.
Is there any other wide receivers that you're going to be staying away from a little bit early in drafts where they're going?
Yeah. And it kind of hurts me to say this when I was thinking about this player because I really love watching him, but it's Deebo Samuel. Here we go again, right? It's I just think that heading into last year, he was a player that I had some concerns about, just kind of due to the expectations I'll say placed on him by the fantasy community. Now we all remember what he was able to do in 2021 when he caught 77, 121 targets. Over 1,400 receiving yards, 6 touchdowns, and the rushing ability, which kind of has fantasy managers salivating. I think he had 59 carries for 365 yards and 8 touchdowns. And I kind of look at that as his ceiling since that touchdown efficiency was insane. And ultimately, we kind of saw what happened last year because in the offseason heading into the previous season, it's Samuel said, hey, I want to be used more as a wide receiver than a wide back. And even after he was re-signed, he seemed comfortable with the offensive direction that the 49ers ultimately sold to him. And fantasy managers yeah, this is great. We're still going to get that rushing upside. But obviously Samuel didn't have the season that fantasy managers expected. So he only averaged 12 fantasy points per game. He dealt with a lot of injuries. He finishes the wide receiver 35 PPR formats. And, you look at the 49ers and they're blessed with an abundance of playmakers. They've got Christian McCaffrey now. Of course, you got George Kittle. You got Brandon Ayuk. And if defenses are you know what? We want to take Deebo Samuel away. They've got other players that can easily fill the void. And also, you just never know with this Kyle Shanahan offense on which player will the 49ers feature any given week in their offensive game plan. And they're just other receivers I would rather prioritize over Samuel when you're looking at the cost that you would have to pay to acquire him and add him to your team. So
yeah, I'm 100% with you. Unfortunately, again, Christian McCaffrey's there, George Kittle's there, Brandon Ayuk is there, and we don't know who the starting quarterback is going to be, which is a recipe for why are you drafting him at wide receiver 16? You know what I mean? It's like if I may use it's like going on a date and on the surface they're beautiful, they're amazing and everything looks really good, but the red flags are just all around. And on the surface it looks great and you're excited about it, but sometimes the price tag on some of those is just not ultimately going to be worth it. But what do you think Deebo Samuel's ceiling is this year? So with all these weapons, with the quarterback carousel, we have no idea who's going to. Like, what do you think that Deebo Samuel's best season looks like in a perfect world this year, especially with the fact that he's might not be running the ball as much as previous years with
Yeah.
someone like Christian McCaffrey and Eli Mitchell still there?
Yeah, very true. Yeah, I'm thinking more so like a wide receiver 2, maybe like a mid-range wide receiver 2. I just think it's going to be hard for him to even replicate what he was able to do a couple of seasons ago. Back in 2021. I want to say 2020. I was like, that's wrong. And, it's going to be hard for him to replicate what he did in 2021 just because of all the playmakers. So, I would say he could end up finishing like as a wide receiver 2, but just given the uncertainty on who will be featured, by the 49ers week in and week out, they do like to lean heavily on the run. Why wouldn't they if they have, Brock Purdy or Trey
Yeah.
Lance under center? I would just end up waiting. If you desperately want exposure to this offense, I would just wait to get Brandon Ayuk if you want a receiver. But I think Kittle will always be a constant in this offense. But again, it's just I just think the ceiling is just a wide receiver 2, and at that price tag, I'm just not willing to make that investment if that's what the ceiling's looking like.
Yep, I agree. I don't see a wide receiver 1 in his range of outcomes. I think
No.
there's just too many guys that are above him that I would have ranked above him. They have just so much better of a shot. Like, I think the ceiling is he rushes for like 6 or 7 touchdowns again on like 30 carries and happens to finish as like the wide receiver 13 or 14. I just don't see him sneaking into the top 12. Ultimately, another player that I do not see sneaking into the top 12 is Mike Evans. And ultimately, it's a consistency thing. Even with Tom Brady last year, Mike Evans played 15 games.
Up and
Eric,
down.
he finished as a top 30 wide receiver in 5 of his 15 games, top 30, with Tom Brady at quarterback and with the Bucks passing 3 more times per game than any NFL team. And he still couldn't finish in the top 30 more times than that. So how do you expect that to change with potentially Baker Mayfield at quarterback? I mean, Mike Evans averaged 8.4 targets per game. Like I said, they led the NFL in pass attempts per game. He is going to turn 30 years old before the season starts.
Yeah,
And
very
Baker
true.
Mayfield has only supported one top 12 QB in his entire career, and it was Jarvis Landry, who finished as the exact wide receiver 12. So I just don't see it from Mike Evans this year. Please tell me if I'm wrong here. I have anything different. Do you think that Mike Evans is a higher ceiling than a top 12 wide receiver right now?
Yeah, I don't think so, especially where you brought up the point of having like Baker Mayfield there. If he wasn't able to be more consistent and have like a lights out season like with Tom Brady, I just don't see it being any different with someone like Baker Mayfield. But just looking like at his, I would say the only thing that kind of gives me some optimism is if his ADP, like if it drops.
Yeah.
You always kind of have that caveat. If a lot of people are down on him, I'd be willing to roll with him as a wide receiver 2 or flex, just depending on the format. But it's tough to have confidence in him given what happened with Brady and also given the situation heading into this year. So, I'm right there with you, and I'm a big Mike Evans guy. So, I hate to see it.
Yep. And again, we love the player. I get it. He's had, 1,000-yard seasons every year of his career.
Yeah.
But I think ultimately this is going to be the year that he falls, and probably the year he proves us wrong, but it just will not be efficient on a week-to-week basis whatsoever. We each have one player left to talk about. Eric, you are the guest, so we will start with you. Who is the last overvalued player that we have to talk about today?
Yeah, this one, I don't know if someone would consider this like controversial or not, just given how this player looked last year. But I'm actually going with George Pickens here. So I'm going to be kind of a contrarian guy here, and I'll try to state my case. But Pickens kind of showed us last year, I'll say from a film perspective, as a rookie, what I think really mesmerized us when watching him in college. The hands, the athleticism, the body control, the ability to separate from defenders. We all saw that. Like, he's a player who caught 52 of 84 targets for 801 receiving yards, had 5 touchdowns, had a very healthy ADOT or average depth of target at 14.5 yards, had great rapport with rookie quarterback Kenny Pickett. They were out there making it happen. And they should have even more chemistry heading into the 2023 season. So the Steelers, they struggled offensively. You had Matt Canada there as the OC, kind of up and down. I know they had to restructure some things as the season progressed, but I just believe Pittsburgh will be more calibrated on offense in 2023. They're a young team. That full NFL offseason obviously help here, but I really like Deontay Johnson as a bounce back candidate. And I think he's currently like the wide receiver 39. So he's obviously behind Pickens, who I guess according to ADP people are looking at as the number one receiver. But people kind of forgot about Deontay Johnson's like story. I think all they think about is like, oh, look at Johnson. He caught more passes without scoring a touchdown than anyone else in the history of the NFL. Ha ha ha. That's true. I'm like, he had 86, I think, receptions. But look, I'm big on the narrative here. So remember, we had Johnson, who sat out the first couple of weeks of training camp. This is a guy that wanted a contract extension, which he ultimately got. He worked with Mitch Trubisky a lot in the offseason, who was expected to be their starting quarterback. He didn't get many reps of Kenny Pickett. He didn't. George Pickens did. That'll obviously change this offseason, that knowing that Pickett is the guy. But I just don't see Johnson having as poor, or I would even say inconsistent of a season as he did in 2022 and 2023. This is still a receiver over the last two seasons who's averaged 9.5 targets per game. So I just find myself more in drafts prioritizing Deontay Johnson because he's less expensive than someone like George Pickens, who a lot of people have eyes on right now. Again, controversial, but that's kind of my assessment of the situation.
I agree. I mean, Deontay Johnson was like, according to Matt Harmon's reception perception is like one of the greatest, separators that we've seen over the last decade. Like he was top 5. He was the number 1 receiver versus zone coverage in 2021 and the number 5 or 6, I think it was, versus man coverage. Like he didn't all of a sudden fall off. It was the quarterback play that just absolutely nuked him. And like you said, like he still, caught more passes than George Pickens did last year. So why are we taking him? It's not like he's a 35-year-old wide receiver. He's like 27 this year in his prime, like playing for the Steelers. But George Pickens is going wide receiver 36. Some players going after him are guys like Treylon Burks, Deontay Johnson. I mean, Rashad Bateman, I don't know about Rashad Bateman, but Brandon Cooks is going after him. Michael Thomas even is someone I'd be willing to take a risk on. Heck, you can get Juju Smith-Schuster for the Patriots going as the wide receiver 51 a few rounds later in drafts. Like, I don't even love Juju, but at that price point, like I'm not touching George Pickens. But the last guy that I'm not touching is our only tight end of the show today, with probably the most ridiculous underdog draft price of all time, dare I say, and it's Dawson Knox. I'm sorry, I'm a bitter Patriots fan. I was there in week 18 when they destroyed our playoff hopes, but Dawson Knox and fantasy are just two words that do not belong in the same sentence. He is going as a top 12 tight end right now on underdog, and that is after over the last 2 years, 31 games. In the games where he did not score a touchdown, he has just 3 top 20 finishes at the tight end position. This is not running back or wide receiver. This is the top 20 tight ends. He's only finished 3 times in the games where he has not scored a touchdown. That is a very poor rate. Over those 2 seasons, 31 games, he has hit 50 receiving yards in just 22% of those games, and he has seen 6 or more targets in 29% of those games. His highest target share in 4 seasons in Buffalo is 13%, and the highest target rate, which is the targets per route run, in his entire career was the 27th best tight end in the NFL. I just like, unless he scores 15 touchdowns this year, I just don't see how he's productive. Like, I'd be chasing targets, I'd be chasing volume, I'd be chasing receiving yards, but I'm not chasing whether I'm flipping heads or tails every week, whether or not Dawson Knox is going to score a touchdown. I can't do it. I'm targeting guys later that are more athletic, that see higher target rates, and have more chance for a lot of volume. And again, it's not like there's all these insane target getters in Buffalo. It's just Stephon Diggs. You know what I mean? It's been Stephon Diggs, Cole Beasley, Gabe Davis. These are guys that are not getting crazy target shares, and he still can't command targets. Again, I don't hate the player. I don't hate the person. I just hate the volume and the underlying metrics. I can't do it. Please, Eric, correct me if I'm wrong. Am I missing anything on Dawson Knox?
No, not at all. Especially if you're looking at tight end, I'd just rather just wait or just kind of have like a committee of guys, 2 or 3 tight ends that you can use. Like, I know Juwan Johnson is one that comes to mind. I think he's like a pretty nice value. just pairing him with someone like Hayden Hurst, or just there's a host of tight ends out there that have a lot of upside and are in a position to outperform their average draft position. I just think many are probably intoxicated by the fact that Knox is tied to the high octane and explosive Buffalo Bills offense, but I'm right there with you. He's just not someone that I would end up prioritizing in drafts.
Well, you could get Zach Ertz, who is going like 40 spots lower at the tight end.
Yeah.
Actually, sorry, excuse me. Zach Ertz is going 90 draft spots lower.
Yeah, that's a great option.
Dawson Knox is. Like that's literally a full 7.5 rounds of a fantasy football draft that you can get Zach Ertz later. And Zach Ertz was a top 3 tight end before he got hurt. I know he's old, but like who else is going to compete for targets? DeAndre Hopkins is most likely going to be gone. Yes, Rondale Moore is going to be there, but is he going to stay on the field? Same thing with Hollywood Brown. Like Zach Ertz has done nothing but be productive in every NFL offense that he's ever played in. So like, why is that going to change this year when you can at least take that risk 7.5 rounds later, people? Okay, you've all had enough about my Dawson Knox. Hey, I apologize, but I just can't do it. And that is not just me being bitter. But that is it for our show today. That is the 10 overvalued players. Before we get out of here, Eric, you do so much amazing work. Where can the people find you, and where can they watch you on some national television shows?
Yeah, I would say the best place to find me is on social media. I love Twitter. I'm active on there quite a bit. You can find me there at Eric N. Moody. Excuse me. Wow, Mooney. I'm turning my name into Mooney now, apparently. Eric N. Moody. So also, I'm on TikTok. I'm on Instagram. I'm trying to grow my following on those platforms. But you can find all my content over at ESPN. Whether it's sports betting content or fantasy content on the NFL, NBA, WNBA. I cover all 3 of those sports. And you may see me on Daily Wager, ESPN Bet, Fantasy Focus, This Just In. So I'll go and put this out there because I wrote you may remember this question that I posted on Twitter about, as a content creator, what's like one of your bucket list items. So I'm gonna be open and vulnerable here. I'm gonna throw something out there. So what do you think, Alex? What do you think?
One of the best. It's one of the best things you can do as a content creator.
It's just like a bucket list item, like one thing as a content creator that you have on your bucket list. So I would say for me, I would love to be a regular on like Around the Horn. That's something that's on my list.
I love that. That would be fantastic. A bucket list. Oh, a bucket list item for me would be someday getting to have Matthew Berry on my show. I know he doesn't work for ESPN more, but like he is like the holy grail. He's probably the biggest fantasy pioneer that has ever existed. I've not met him personally, but everyone I've ever met that has talked to him said he is just like the kindest, best dude ever. For those that have met him before. So he is someone that I'm obviously a big fan of and someone I've looked up to across my fantasy journey. So I'd love to host a show with him on it someday. That'll be a bucket list item. But the biggest bucket list item of them all is to have Eric Moody back on the fantasy podcast at some point in time. Don't forget to follow him at Eric N. Moody on the Twitter machine. Follow me at Alex Caruso. And don't forget to keep listening to new episodes of the Fresh Fantasy Podcast every Tuesday and Friday. But until next time, keep chasing that upside.